Hi, my name is Lex Williford, and this is Advanced Fiction Writing, Forms in the Narrative Book, an advanced writing workshop that focuses on writing long narratives and books of fiction. Anyone who's workshopped a book-length narrative knows that traditional workshops aren't well suited for the book. Sustained narratives of whatever kind and shape that go beyond 150 pages. Because most workshops last only a quarter or a semester, they are poorly suited for anything but the short story. A narrative whose shape has some kind of closure, and whose story doesn't propel us forward into other episodes or series of events. This limitation can create problems for thesis students at the beginning of MFA programs, and for writers working on books of short stories and novelists. Writers who don't write individual short narratives in isolation from others. Graduate programs sometimes make a few potentially false assumptions about how graduate workshops prepare students for writing their theses. 1. Students will write short pieces to learn the basics of craft in their first few years. 2. Then somehow all these short pieces will add up to a book-length work of publishable quality, an MFA thesis. 3. Students who don't want to use their workshop pieces for their theses must start from scratch and write their entire thesis projects in their final year. These assumptions raise an important question which I confront all the time. Is it possible to write an entire publishable book in 2 semesters? If you want to teach, publishing a book in many ways is your way out of what I call the dark satanic instructor mills. Years spent teaching with huge course loads at the high school, college, or university levels. As many as 5 classes. One of my former students taught 8 classes last semester, no kidding. Classes filled with too many students, hundreds of composition papers to grade, and almost no way to teach writing well, since it usually takes small class sizes simply to begin. And while you're teaching, you're supposed to finish your book. It's hard to pull off. There's no better time to put a publishable book together than while you're in graduate school. And then publish it so you can get a tenure-track job. And it's always best to start now, wherever you are in your MFA program. By the way, and I learned this the hard way, if you're not getting paid as much as a PhD in an English department, remind the chair that according to the Associated Writing Programs, your MFA is the equivalent of a PhD with book publication. Most universities don't make a distinction between an MA and an MFA, and this correlation is incorrect. Ultimately, the question we should be asking ourselves is this: why not begin preparing for the thesis from the beginning of an MFA program rather than at the very last minute? Despite what others might tell you, the final goal of an MFA program isn't the thesis. The real purpose and goal of writing the MFA thesis is to publish a book. The thesis discussed in thesis defenses is more often than not a snapshot of a book in progress, often just at the beginning of a book that still needs a lot of work. Students working on their theses usually don't finish them as publishable novels or books of stories until they've graduated and spent a year or several years expanding, contracting, cutting, crafting, and revising their original theses. Because of other demands, when they receive their MFA degrees, too many students simply stop writing, when in fact they're only just at the beginning of their careers. Traditional workshops tend to look at parts rather than wholes, at short narratives isolated from larger, more complex structures. Writers working on episodic fiction that relies on linear cause and effect or other nonlinear or modular connections have trouble seeing their progress over time on a book-length work, and often have no help or guidance unless it comes from each other. To prepare other workshop students for critiquing their documents, I recommend that those who have manuscripts up for discussion summarize in a few paragraphs what's come before in their book-length projects, chapters, or stories. But a plot summary rarely gives a book-length project a clear context or a sense of the richness of the previous chapters or stories. If questions arise in a chapter or story that other chapters or stories have already answered, students can waste a lot of workshop time trying to explain previous events and character motives, rather than dealing with one particular chapter as it relates to a larger whole, a larger structure. The truth is that most writing professors or graduate student peers don't have time to read many book-length projects, or to discuss larger issues of organization or overarching themes, linear, nonlinear, and dramatic structures. Students entering Masters of the Fine Arts program should probably be thinking about their final thesis projects the very first day they begin studying for their MFAs. It's an intimidating thought, I know, but writing a thesis is not nearly as difficult as students might think, if they have the right tools and give themselves plenty of time to write and revise. The central issue is time and when to begin. While there's a great deal of flexibility and room to explore thesis possibilities early on, am I writing a novel, a book of stories, a novel and stories? Preparing from the beginning of a book-length work takes some preparation and considerable thought and planning. Because so much of writing a book is about making detours that may be dead ends, a writer must think of using her time as effectively as possible, seeing her writing time as sacred, making time for so-called wrong turns or red herrings or superfluous characters in their own narratives that either disappear from the final drafts or completely change by the time they finish their books. And they do change. They always change. I've designed this course and presentation in much the same way I'll describe in this presentation, starting with a map, then writing these words once I know where I want to go. Is that process in any way like yours? Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't really matter. I'm just passing along a few things I've learned over 30 years of writing and teaching fiction and other narrative forms like the screenplay and the nonfiction essay and memoir. I've designed this course partly to help students look ahead toward their MFA theses, but also to help them begin learning how to write publishable books for the rest of their professional lives, at whatever pace seems right for them. I'm a slow writer, and it's taken me years to understand and accept my own distinctive writing process. When writers begin thinking about short pieces as parts of something longer than, say, a short story, they begin to accumulate ideas for future short pieces that more fully explore the books they want to write. And that accumulation is often unpredictable. For me, the real joy of discovery as I write. When writers begin mapping out their plans for a book-length narrative, they also stop fearing the blank page and the intimidating thought of writing a book, and then begin to see what they need to write and develop and how to organize that material into an evolving, organic shape. Whether you're a new MFA student just beginning to think about your thesis, or you're working on thesis revisions before you begin your thesis year, you may use this class as a starting point for your thesis proposal and the 20-page writing sample that goes with it. And you can use this work with me and your groups as a starting point to choose your thesis advisor and second reader, relying less on others than on yourself to get the work done. This course is designed to help you find a way to balance the needs of your own distinctive writing process with the demands of the distinctive book you're growing, so that the writing is less difficult and overwhelming and your book structure is organic rather than predetermined, so that you're beginning not from plot but from character as plot. Heraclitus's notion that a man or a woman's character is his or her fate. A deterministic notion for sure, unless the character gains self-awareness through epiphany and insight and has the courage and the ability to change. In many respects, writing books helps us to change ourselves, to gain the courage to tell our own distinctive stories in our own distinctive voices, and to be aware of what we're writing, to be willing, if necessary, to change our books with the knowledge we accumulate by writing them. This course, I hope, will give you the tools to write and, if necessary, change what you've written again and again until you believe everything you've written represents your own distinctive truth, the book only you can write. And that's an important point. While as Williford and other writers all the way back to Aristotle have suggested, there may be only a limited number of story types, there's only one of you in all of time, one lifetime of stories that have yet to be told with the kind of individual specificity and voice you can tell them in, the place and historical time, and the people you grew up with and live with now in this very moment. If you don't tell your own story, the story of your culture and your place in it, no one else will, and it will be lost to memory in the cataclysms of history. I've designed this course to help you be productive and to remain productive, dealing with the external problems of technique or the internal problems of balancing generating or sequencing mind, or even psychological and emotional blocks that make all of us avoid writing in the first place. I've designed this course to help you learn craft, and if the demands of craft get in your way, to keep moving and revise and craft later in subsequent drafts. I've designed this course to help you write around blocks and to keep moving, to find strong forward momentum so you can find that zone we all write for, that moment when we start at 9 a.m. and end at 5 p.m. and realize we've written for 8 hours, lost in the vivid continuous dream of our stories. I've designed this course to help you make leaps in your writing from wherever you are in your writing career, with the understanding that some of you may just be beginning. I take it as a given that each of you enter this course at your own individual levels, and that we'll not be comparing each other's expressions so much as seeing everyone's book at where it is right now. I'm far less interested in your being brilliant where you are than in your making as many leaps in your writing as you can, the main criterion for the grade you receive in this class. When I studied for my MFA, the program had many stars who had short careers and many writers who kept writing through it all and ended up winning awards and publishing many books over many years. I've designed this course to help you surprise yourself. If you're not surprising yourself, you're not surprising your reader. Surprise, discovery, revelation, epiphany. These are the course's final goals, the final goals of anyone setting out on the journey of writing a book. We'll be spending a good bit of time thinking about and discussing process in this class because we all must understand our own processes even to begin considering writing a book-length narrative. How then would you describe your writing process? Do you write linear stories from beginning to end? Do you write stories in a non-linear order? Or do you do a combination of both? Do you write entire narratives without revising as you go? Or do you revise as you go, tweaking every sentence, paragraph, and scene until it's as close to true as you can get it? No matter where you are in the process of writing a book, planning, researching, beginning, trudging through a long middle, or writing an ending and having trouble finding the right kind of quiet closure or satisfying open ending you want, I'm going to be asking you to consider a few important questions about yourself and the project you're committing several years of your life to work on and finish. What kind of writer are you? Are you a linear writer of linear narratives? Are you a nonlinear writer of linear narratives? Or are you a nonlinear writer of nonlinear narratives? These questions, confusing as they are, may seem silly, and you may not have written enough to know the answers in any case. You may even resent having to label yourself. But the best way to write is to discover how you write, perhaps like no one else. And labels like these are just a way of beginning to understand something that may still be a mystery to most of you. My writing process remains a mystery to me, even now. But I might understand it a bit better just because I've had more time to ask these questions, more years of writing to identify the patterns unique to my own writing process. Many linear writers, especially short story writers, tend to write linear narratives, for example. That is, they start at the beginning and end at the end, and most of the book remains linear as it was written, with a few changes in many drafts or just a few. On the other hand, some writers, especially writers of novels, can tend to write long projects out of order, letting the fire burning in their bellies determine which stories are most important as their book projects evolve and change. I'm this kind of writer, a nonlinear writer of mostly linear narratives. I'm not asking you to write the way I do, of course. I'm asking you to try a few methods to see if they might help you understand and describe your own writing process by the end of this course, and perhaps even improve it. Many writers find traditional stories and story conventions to be, well, too conventional. I tend to think that traditional dramatic narratives are often the most difficult to write, because finding new ways of using old forms is extremely difficult to do. But maybe that's just me. It's all a matter of originality. Non-traditionalist writers who don't write standard logical, linear, and chronological sequences, but they write stories and scenes and chapters out of order and then keep them out of order or completely rearrange them altogether, following intuitive series of connections or postmodern texts that are openly self-conscious about being texts themselves through, say, a series of collages, connecting parts of text through images or memory triggers rather than through cause and effect. And many writers use a combination of both. I certainly do. Each separate technique gives us more opportunities to tell our stories in our own ways. I don't agree with Robert Frost that writing free verse or any kind of nonlinear narrative is like playing tennis without a net. I think we have to create our own rules and decide on our own if we're going to use a net at all. Then teach our readers how to understand the rules of each of our books as soon as we possibly can in the book. Another question many workshops rarely ask. Are you writing a literary novel, a book whose structure and shape arise from the telling organically? Are you writing novels about your own obsessions, discovering surprising insights about and original structures in your own fiction as you write, with your own distinctive voice and vision? Are you writing to discover meaning as you go, or do you already know everything that happens in your story? Are you writing with deep organic characterization about people you know, places you know, that move far beyond stereotype, that try to undermine stereotypical thinking? Are you a Chicano-Chicana writer, a black writer, a GLBT writer? Are you an Anglo writer trying to overcome the stereotypes and labels insensitive and unthinking white people have so often portrayed in recent years? Labels such as these can be limiting for many. I've had several students say that they don't want to be called Chicano or gay writers. They just want to be writers. And I think they're right, since most of us are trying to be our own authentic selves, individuals. Beginning from a specific cultural tradition, though, helps ground us and become part of a discourse about, say, injustice and the inequities of power. These labels are just starting points from which we can realize our own distinctive cultural identities and our own voices within that culture. We learn about our own evolving cultural traditions and by reading other writers who teach us about where we're from and who we are. The other question is this: are you writing a genre novel? MFA programs have a reputation, undeserved I think, of discouraging genre novels and stories, not because literary writers are snooty, superior, know-it-all, pipe-smoking liberal literati living in their ivy towers, but because genre books tend to be stereotypical, derivative, and predictable, with conventional and familiar plots and characters, much like the latest zombie movie we might have seen last week. Such a judgment may often seem unfair, but when it comes to quality literary fiction and MFA programs, it's too often just a given. Ask yourself this then. Do you want to write about zombies or vampires simply because that's what's selling right now, or because you want to make big bucks? Are you writing about fantasy characters with artificially formal diction, as if you were a Brit living in the Middle Ages, when in reality you live in Juarez and are completely bilingual and your grandmother shot your brother-in-law's pit bull last night over a gambling debt, or had to move to El Paso to escape from the terrible violence of the drug wars there? How true are genre stories to your own, and how can you be true to your own stories? Are you avoiding writing about the hard truths simply because you can't face them? What are your deeper reasons for writing genre fiction? Gifted writers like Anne Rice often use genre fiction as a new way to write, to create surprising, authentic metaphors about deeply personal subjects, rather than simply to borrow and just slightly change the standard stereotypes and cliches of the genre. In addition to making New Orleans come alive in her own distinctive way and a voice as distinctive as the New Orleans John Kennedy O'Toole described in Confederacy of Dunces, she began writing about vampires as a metaphor of a deeply personal tragedy, the loss of one of her children to cancer. A blood disease as deadly and haunting as the vampire's bite, and in many ways this genre was the only way she could write indirectly about her own grief. Making money is a perfectly legitimate goal, even when we know writing is less a commodity than a gift that comes to us so we can pass it along and pay it forward. We all have to find a way to make a living too, and many of us don't want to teach. I have many friends who don't. A poet friend of mine in Seattle drove a bus for many years, and he's a great poet. Unfortunately, some students assume that MFA programs see genre writing as inferior, when in fact all the requirements of strong literary narratives can help to improve and deepen traditional genre novels. If you're planning to write a genre novel, you must convince us though the story arises from a genre tradition, your own unique voice and vision will make that genre utterly your own. This course will ask you to write a tentative book proposal in 2 drafts, one at the beginning of the semester and one at the end. A proposal you may use as a starting point for your thesis proposal at the end of this semester or in a year or 2. First, what kind of book are you planning to write for this project? A novel? If so, are you planning to write a traditional novel? A long, mostly episodic, mostly linear, mostly chronological narrative with the same characters that doesn't necessarily have complete closure chapter by chapter? Does the book resolve one conflict you've introduced earlier but create another conflict that hurls us more deeply into the drama of the narrative? Or does each conflict build upon another, taking a character deeper into a hell of his or her own making? Or are you writing a non-traditional, non-linear, experimental novel? A long, non-linear narrative with the same or many different characters that doesn't have complete closure chapter by chapter and that tends to have complex shifts in time or point of view? Or is the book you're planning to write a combination of these, using each technique when it helps carry your story forward? There's no right way to write a novel. There's only your way. And you won't discover it until you've written your first draft, and your second, and your third, and on and on. On the other hand, are you writing narrative memoir? Collections of narrative essays? While this course focuses primarily on fictive narratives, creative nonfiction writers have borrowed many of the techniques of poets and fiction writers, pushing the boundaries of that form in remarkable ways over the last 30 years. If you're not writing a novel, are you writing a short story collection? If so, will these be unlinked stories, narratives of 100 words to 30 pages, or even novellas up to 100 pages that don't necessarily share the same characters, settings, or themes? Or are you planning to write linked stories, similar narratives whose stories and characters are linked somewhat, but aren't necessarily following a long character arc across the stories? If you're a novelist or short story writer, are you writing a novel in stories, similar narratives whose stories have complete closure as individual stories, yet also work as episodes in a larger narrative with linked characters and a mostly complete character arc across those stories? What kind of writing assignment have you given yourself? And that's the big question. And how complex will it be? The advantage of writing the novel in stories is that you're much more likely to get those stories published individually, something that helps sell a book in the long term. And since many publishers prefer novels over story collections in the first place, you have the flexibility to write what you can call a novel. In many respects, writing chapters is different than writing stories, with their own distinctive closure, and unlinked stories are often easier to write than stories that also serve as chapters. At least that's been my experience. I know these days because mostly I'm writing novels and stories. One of the best ways of seeing all the possibilities of writing novels and stories is to read as many as you can. Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, and Dennis Johnson's Jesus Son, and Sandra Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek, and Junot Diaz's Drown, and there are many, many others. Another question this course will ask you has to do with the proposed shape and structure of the novel or book of stories you plan to write. Chances are this proposal will end up significantly different than the way you envision it now, especially if you're flexible about letting your discoveries as you write help you revise the map you're growing as you're writing. And that's all good. The real joy of writing a novel is the daily discovery that surprises us and keeps us wanting to write to find out where we're going. Do you see your book as a traditional linear episodic realistic novel that occurs mostly in the present action with few flashbacks or backstory? Or is it a nonlinear episodic and realistic novel that occurs partly in the present action and partly in the past action? Is it a frame story that begins and ends with the present action and mostly recounts the past action in chronological order? Or is it a layer cake story that alternates between present and past action stories? Call them present action cake and past action icing if you want. These basic structures are of course overly simplistic, but they're a good way to begin deciding the most effective way of structuring your book. Or do you see your book as a non-linear, non-episodic, or modular narrative that switches time or points of view in a mostly unpredictable way, subverting the conventions of the traditional book-length narrative? Or does your book begin with magical realist or surrealistic premises, blending realism with magical elements? Are you writing autobiographical fiction? Or fiction based upon characters utterly unlike yourself? Or are you writing a little bit of both? Is your novel based upon your own history, or a historical event, or both? I often write autobiographical fiction, but it is fiction. As Jane Ann Phillips suggests in the epigraph of her first story collection, do your stories begin in autobiography and end in dream? While I may begin with autobiographical elements and memories, I've noticed that the more I invent, the more I lie, the truer the stories become. I'm not talking about lies that destroys here. I'm talking about lies that create, lies in service of a much larger truth than simple fact. Life is chaotic, and writing fiction is a way of finding some order or structure underlying that chaos. Do you write what you know, or do you avoid writing autobiographical fiction altogether? Do you write what you don't know, novels based upon current or historical research? Or are you writing a novel that weaves a personal story into a larger historical narrative? How would you describe your story's point of view? Is it a kind of distant camera eye or 19th century godlike omniscience? After years of writing, I've come to believe, as Gustave Flaubert showed us, that the omniscient, godlike narrator is dead. And good riddance. But that's only because what I call the first or third person intimate point of view creates greater intimacy with the reader. Does the story have a single protagonist and point of view, or does it have many distinctive points of view and voices? In other words, is it written in one voice or many? The focus of this course will mostly be your own writing. In other words, the main text of this class is the book you're writing right now, or want to begin. The only other text will be Brian Shaver's The Language of Fiction, the best guide to writing and revising narratives I've read in a while. The book is certainly more up-to-date than Strunk and White's Elements of Style, and because its focus is on narrative conventions, it's well suited for answering many questions of grammar and craft I can't answer in the depth I'd like. While I've amassed a long series of short lectures I paste into your documents on anything from comma splices to exposition through dialogue, I admire and respect Shawver's book, which uses a mix of both descriptive and prescriptive discussions of everything from grammar to betrayals of language, and it really digs into some of the common and sometimes controversial arguments about narrative craft and technique. In a sense, the book teaches the important rules and conventions of narrative, discussing the pros and cons of different arguments about those rules and conventions, then lets us choose what works best for our own writing. Here are the rules, Shawver tells us, and here's how to break them. Or better yet, here's how to teach readers the distinctive rules of our own books. We simply show those rules early in our books and remain reasonably consistent about them. William Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy use the slang contraction ain't without the apostrophe, and they do so every time, signaling to us that what would otherwise look like a grammatical mistake is instead a stylistic choice. For years I considered writing a text of my own until I read this one. Instead of asking you to spend a lot of money on other texts, I'll ask you to invest in some fairly inexpensive software that can help you write more effortlessly in what I describe as generating and sequencing mind. All I'm asking you to do is to try it for one semester. If the methods I describe don't help, you can go back to Microsoft Word when this class is over, or whatever seems to work best for you. The learning curve's a bit high for some of this software, especially Scrivener, and it takes time to learn all the cool features of each program. But if you have questions, you can check out all the tutorials on websites and watch the many videos on YouTube that technical experts have already written. I admit I'm a geek, but I'm not necessarily the go-to guy for tech support, okay? Better to contact the software developer directly. And when you learn something new, you can share it with the rest of class. I'll also ask that you write 2 drafts of your own book proposal, no more than about 4 pages including bibliography, based upon submitting your thesis proposal in the MFA program's Thesis and Defense Guidelines. I won't require that you include a bibliography of theoretical influential books, but I might be able to help you begin your reading list, especially if you're trying to find models of the kinds of book you want to write. Following this MFA document, I'll ask you to write Proposal Draft 1, due toward the beginning of the 2nd month of the course. In it, using this presentation as a guide, I'll also ask you to discuss and analyze your writing process as you understand it now, including the kinds of writing blocks you're encountering. What obstacles are you facing as a writer? Are they external, internal, or both? What, if anything, is keeping you from writing the book you want to write? And how do you plan to deal with writer's block? I'm not looking for excuses, but genuine blocks that arise from your writing naturally as you write, and many of them are very common. At the end of this course, in addition to following the MFA program's guide for thesis proposal, I'll ask you to write and submit Draft 2 of your book proposal, including a description and analysis of what you've written and how your process and book in progress may have evolved this semester, and which techniques might have helped most in any writing breakthroughs you've had, describing how you've overcome writing obstacles and the like. Also, I'll ask you to write a final draft of the written critiques of your 2 group peers' books in progress, no more than about 3 pages. Critique 1 at the beginning of the course will describe 2 other writers' books in progress projects, including their current structure, and depending on what those writers request, a descriptive and/or prescriptive critique of their books in progress. Then, at the end of the course, I'll ask you to write Critique 2, which will describe the changes in these 2 other writers' projects, especially improvements in craft and structure. We'll be doing a lot of group work in this class, work I'll monitor but not interfere with too much. I'm always a little leery of group work because too often the overachiever in the group does most of the work and the underachiever just coasts. For this reason, I won't be grading your group's work per se, just the individual analyses you're giving each other at the beginning and the end of the semester. In addition to reading and writing analyses of at least 2 drafts of the books in progress your peers are writing, we'll focus on workshopping individual stories and/or chapters, mostly out of context, to discuss specific matters of craft and technique. 2 workshops for each student in the class, one before mid-semester and one after. Please note that because some of you may just now be beginning a book project, and some may be halfway through a draft or revising a draft you've already written several times, I want to make clear that we'll start discussion of your book projects wherever they are in those projects. You don't have to have a book draft written. You may not even have written anything yet, and you certainly don't have to write an entire book this semester. The point is to get started with a map of your future work this semester and beyond. The main premise of the class's group work is that you'll help your peers in your groups with the overall structure of their books, while the entire class focuses on crafting 2 short stories or chapters. In fact, your group peers may also help give a context to the shorter works we workshop and save us the time of covering material found in other parts of your books in progress. I may also set up online or on-campus conferences so that each of you can discuss your book's overall structure to brainstorm ideas. If not, you're free to contact me so we can discuss any ideas or problems you're facing. If we have time, we might also do several ungraded exercises just to get you started on this semester's work. Please note, I'd rather not read old writing from previous years or semesters. Only new work written for this class in both generating mind and sequencing mind. Of course, as much as I'd like to, I don't have time to read everyone's book projects, though I will look over those projects to make comments about the structure at the end of the semester. In addition to my other classes and thesis projects, I have my own books to write. If you want me to read your book projects, ask me to be on your thesis committee. I can't guarantee I'll say yes, mostly because of the growing number of students in the online and on-campus writing programs. If you want me to direct your thesis, ask early. I've been directing as many as 8 student theses per year, and I'm limiting the numbers I direct to no more than about 4 or 5 a year now. I wish I could do more, but I'm working on keeping my sanity. In on-campus classes, we'll combine our class discussions with our asynchronous Adobe Acrobat comments in synchronous workshops, together, in the same room. In online courses, we'll combine our class discussions in asynchronous discussion boards, group discussion boards, and Adobe Acrobat comments in asynchronous workshops. I'm not a big fan of imposing expectations on myself or other writers. If I had a choice, I would grade nothing, but simply let writers write and see what happens. While I'm sure we all want to write to our highest expectations eventually, as William Stafford suggests, I think it's best to write to our lowest expectations, especially in early drafts. These potentially crippling expectations include the expectations of others, of our peers and our instructors, family and friends, and especially our own expectations. If you're one of those writers who's harder on your own work than the work of any other writer, then you might be setting yourself up for the kinds of perfectionist blocks to your writing that can keep you stuck all the time. Moments when you stop yourself and say, this is no damn good, when you should probably be focusing on keeping the flow of your writing moving forward. The point isn't to beat ourselves up, but to be open to imperfection that may lead us to discoveries we may not have expected. I once painted a field of bluebonnets in a watercolor course as a kid, and when a dark streak of burnt umber dripped onto my canvas and I threw my paintbrush to the floor, my instructor came over to me, picked up my brush, and then painted a giant oak trunk in the middle of that field. A trunk, a tree I had never have imagined, and it made the picture beautiful and perfect. This notion of expectations may seem counterintuitive, but writers must, as Anne Lamott writes in her lovely book, Bird by Bird, they must be willing to write shitty first drafts. Your expectations are certainly more important than mine, and I think those should focus on process rather than product. To make and keep a sacred time to write, at least 2 hours per weekday if possible, and maybe more. Many of the writers I've known often work intensely for about 4 hours and then spend the rest of their time reading or revising every day. An interviewer once asked Cynthia Ozick, "Why do you write every day?" "What if the angel showed up and I wasn't there?" she said. The expectations you create should have to do less with the quality of your writing day by day than to the commitment to make to yourself, to your writing process, and to your work. There's a kind of faith in this, that if you sit down to work, something will come if you're patient. You just have to push a little. But at some point before workshops, I'll ask you to make a commitment to your craft too, to proofread closely and to make your sentences do more than just work, but to begin to move toward the elegant simplicity of poetry. Ultimately, our goals should be to be as productive as we can, writing at our own pace, respecting our own writing processes, and trying to work within our own distinctive limitations and gifts. Finally, this course is about allowing yourself to be open to uncertainty and ambiguity, to make your best effort to work through the difficulties of working with complex software that ultimately may help you be more productive, to write with greater fluency and flow, and to save the work of sequencing and editing your work only when you need to become unstuck. Here's a quick overview of the class. I'm using a mind map here because it's a little bit easier to see. Basically, we're going to be breaking the semester into 3 separate sections. The beginning of the semester, you will have several writing assignments to turn in. Toward the end of the first month, the beginning of the second month. Then we'll spend most of our time in doing workshops. And these will be an opportunity for all of us to make comments on specific chapters or stories that you are going to include in your entire book and revise for a writing sample if you want to turn it in for your thesis proposal. In any case, we'll be focusing in the middle part of the semester mostly on craft and individual sections of stories, and the rest of the time we'll be taking a look at the entire projects. Then at the end of the semester, you're going to have several more writing assignments in which you're going basically to revise something of your critiques for your group members, and then you're also going to turn in your final portfolio. Let me just talk briefly about these here. For the beginning of the semester, you will turn in 2 analyses and critiques of your group members' book projects. These will be the 2 group members that you've been assigned. It'll be the first draft of this, and you'll post it to group discussion boards and assignments if you're an online class. You will submit the first draft of your book proposal. Again, you will follow the guidelines of submitting your thesis proposal from the UTEP MFA handout, Thesis and Defense Guidelines. And you'll also include a few other supplements for me. A 1-paragraph summary of your book, draft 1. Mind map of your book, draft 1. You can use a mind mapping program like the one I'm using here, or any others that you would like, as long as I can open it. Also an analysis of your writing process and of your writing blocks. That'll be 5% of your grade. In the middle part of the semester, as I said before, we will be doing 2 chapters or stories from your book project. One will come before mid-semester and one will come after mid-semester, and you will sign up for both of those at the very beginning of the class. Then at the end of the semester, the major writing assignments that you will have to turn in will be a revision of the analyses and critiques of your 2 group members' book projects. These will be final drafts again, posted to the group discussion boards for the online classes. This will be 2.5% of your grade, a total of 5 since you're doing 2. And then there's the final portfolio, which will again be a final draft of your book proposal. It'll count a little bit more. It'll be 10% of your grade. As before, it will be based upon submitting your thesis proposal. The handout that we hand out to our thesis students towards the end of the semester, it's fairly flexible. If you're really just starting on your book project, then of course you won't be doing some of the things in there. I'm also going to ask that you do a revised 1-paragraph summary of your book, revised mind map of your book, an analysis of how your writing process has changed, improved or not, an analysis of whether or how you've overcome your writing blocks, and your book in progress in Scrivener format. That way I can open it up and take a look at not just the individual parts of the book, but also the overall structure of the book and make some comments about that. That's 10% of your grade. The writing portfolio itself will be the largest portion of your grade. You can use it as your thesis writing sample if you'd like. That's usually 20 pages. So if you want to take the workshop material that you have done and revise it for this final portfolio, which I recommend, I will give you 65% of your grade based upon the writing and the quality of the writing and the craft. Finally, I'll also be grading class participation. On campus, of course, it'll be in the classroom how much you've discussed and joined in on the discussion in class, or discussion boards online, including the group discussion boards in which 3 of you will be discussing each other's work sort of as a group. That's 5% of your grade. And then finally, I'm also going to grade your Adobe Acrobat comments for the workshop documents that we've discussed all semester. I'll ask that you keep a running count of these so I can check your numbers against mine when I calculate final grades, and that is 5% of your final grade. That's a basic overview of the class, just to kind of give you a sense. I'll go into more detail in a little bit.